one.
Next round, Four Corners. Welcome back to the series. And today's guest is StuntrockConfusion, Christian from Sweden/French. And he is somewhat something like a scholar in music. His knowledge is legendary, as you can see if you watch his videos. Today's topic is around the realm of the electronic avant-garde music, and we will see where this topic gets us. Stunty, jump right in. Welcome to the Four Corners.
Thank you, fellow corners. It's a pleasure to be with you. And it's a pleasure to talk about electronic music, a topic that is not that often tackled in the VC. And one that I guess that with our respective experiences, we gather that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what is electronic music, what electronic music could be more accurately. And of course, yeah, I've been around this music. I've been privileged to be around lots of musicians, historical figures of that, growing up in France, where musique concrète is coming from. And Sweden being also quite a big, having a huge history with the electronic music studio and all the different types of specific local electronic music, because that's the thing. People who aren't not that much into electronic music tend to think that electronic music is a genre, is a style, whereas it is music. It's just that it is electronic. Sometimes less electronic than we think, but there's as much a variety of styles within electronic music than in the whole rest of music.
So how do we start?
We're all going to show some records, and we all come from obviously different places, different continents, in many cases, and we got introduced to this type of music in different ways. And as we go around showing some artists, some records, it's got to change a lot, because I know I'm coming from the pop or rock commercial side, how I was introduced to it. So I guess maybe our guest should start showing his first batch.
So maybe the first batch won't be the most exciting music necessarily, but like this is a record I actually showed on one of Michael's videos, a contest. This is Le Solfège de l'Objet Sonore by Pierre Schaeffer. Basically, it's a free LP box set with a book, which is kind of the idea of giving musical value to sounds from different kind of objects with the exclusion of any kind of musical instrument. So this is the start of tape music, musique concrète, in the sense that this is from the late 40s. This is music that is allowed, that is made possible by the tape recorder and effects and amplification. So Pierre Schaffer, he was not necessarily a musician. He was what you would call in French un homme du 19e siècle, a gentleman of the 19th century, which means that he was good at everything, but not specialized. He was a good writer, a good painter, he was just interested in everything, but would never necessarily go that deep. But he would start things. He would help kickstart movements, which is what musique concrète is. And this is the kind of the founding moment of musique concrète. So this is this is not very pleasant to listen to, because it's basically a list of sounds that he then describes in a very subjective way, but he tries to rationalize it, which is highly romantic in my opinion, which is also some part of one of the basis of electronic music in a way.
So he's sort of a Renaissance man.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And kind of like I guess it's more in the realm of sound design rather than music, straight music.
So what happened is that during World War II, or at the tail end of that, at the French national radio, l'ORTF, there was a sound club. People who were just totally mesmerized by this new invention, the tape recorder, a Nazi invention, unfortunately. So they took, instead of using it as it was meant, they tried to find a creative, a romantic function for it, recording sounds. And what can we do with sound? We listen to them. So they would gather every week and listen to the sound that each member of the circle had recorded, and start to find aesthetic, they would attribute aesthetic qualities to different sounds. And then Pierre Schaffer had this weird idea of like starting this as a whole movement, of which the most famous composer would be Pierre Henry. I think I gathered a few of his records here. Pierre Henry, who's he basically is kind of like the French Terry Riley. This one is called Futuristi. He had a deal with Philips, a bit like Terry Riley had with CBS Columbia. So almost all Pierre Henry records were released by Philips, which meant that he could release whatever he wanted also. In Sweden, we had a guy like, Ralph Lundsten, who also started in the early 60s, who also released dozens and dozens of records. The first ones being very abstract, and over the time he went towards music that was a little more on the new age side of things. And he was kind of a weird hippie, almost sexual freak. I visited him one time and he had a few custom synthesizers. One that was actually, basically it was like a synthesizer. So basically a little box with 4 cables. At the end of each cable was like a metal clump or something. So you would hold one, your neighbor would hold one, etc. And every time you touch each other, that made a contact that made a sound. And when he demonstrated this to me, he made like a wink, wink. That was great with the ladies.
It's interesting how most of the major labels in the mid 60s to late 60s would sign at least one or two of these sort of electronic experimental artists. They would designate them and stick them in the classical section, which is a smaller, like you said, Terry Riley, and obviously a Crumb on Columbia as well. Yeah, Terry Riley did all his stuff on Columbia too.
Columbia,
avant-garde. Okay.
So if I got you right with the dates, that means that this person, this musician you showed up at the start, probably also influenced Karlheinz Stockhausen, because he has been earlier.
I think it's a little bit different. So Stockhausen started out in, I believe, with Herbert Heimert and Kränke in 51. So it's very interesting. I think it's good that we talk about it, the ground of it. So this is, I believe that this is the first proper electronic music record ever, like meant as electronic music, not just that uses electronic and has no idea what it is.
Mm-hmm. What year is that?
This is from 51, yeah. So this is Ernst Kränke and Gottfried Michael König, Klangfiguren, Spiritus, Intelligentsia et Sanctus. So Pfingstoratorium für Stingstimmen und elektronische Klänge. And
referring for voices and electronic sounds.
Yeah, and very close to that comes this, the first Stockhausen record, which is also a 10-inch EP. also from 51, I believe. And so what they do basically is, instead of using tape, they use oscillators. Basically, the electronic music in that regard is an oscillator emitting a sine wave. And
Right.
the oscillator means that you can vary the sound wave.
Vary it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That was done at the Köln Music Academy or something, Music Institute. And what is revolutionary about it, and what makes electronic music such a beautiful realm, in my opinion, is that suddenly you escape the concept of 700 years of Western music, which is tonality. Suddenly you're much closer to Indian classical music, microtonality, because when you got the oscillator, when you vary it, you are there's an unlimited amount of tones. You're only limited by how accurate and how you can turn the knob basically on the oscillator. That it's just basically liberating the composer from tonality, which is in itself totally revolutionary. And that starts in 51 in Germany.
I'd like to jump in on a couple things here, because like what happened with the synth movement in the 80s, obviously, a lot of artists, and I'm putting that in quotes, jumped in the bandwagon late 70s and 80s because of synthesizers getting small and handy. And or a handful of them were not really musicians. I'm going back, and I want to talk about an inventor who also was a composer, a jazz into swing music. And in 1946, Raymond Scott started Manhattan Research. And he was he was a composer. He led like CBS Orchestra, did a lot of, one of his most famous tunes, ironically, is called, I think it's called Powerball or Power, I forgot the name of it, but a lot of young people would get to know it later in the 1990s because his music started getting into soundtracks like for Ren and Stimpy cartoons, and that was one of the more famous ones. But he invented, he was one of the first inventors of the ring modulator, and he influenced Robert Moog, later was influenced by him, but he started all these little inventions, making records that were sort of jazz influenced, but with electronic instruments. He had a electronic music studio, Inner Space, actually Willow Park, and there's a series of these records that are musical and experimental at the same time. And he was pretty infamous. He went up and down with success and wasn't really succeeding a lot in his lifetime. He did a special project in 1961-62, which is this. And this was sponsored by the Giselle Institute, which Giselle is Dr. Seuss. And they made a series of records, of electronic records, soothing sounds for babies, which are very moody, ethereal, early ambient, or what Eno and those kind of artists would do. Of course, they kind of flopped, but they did a whole series based on the age of your baby. These have been reissued in the last few years by Music on Vinyl.
Been reissued a few times, actually. Like
Pardon?
every decade there's a reissue of these, the triple pack that you.
Absolutely. And then in fact, in the 70s, ironically, Motown, Berry Gordy hired him for about 9 years, put him on the payroll to invent some electronic instruments for Motown Records. And it was one of those things where after 9 years, he worked on the garage for Motown, and it never became anything. Of course, Motown never went in that direction. But he influenced the Moog synthesizer and modulators and what you're talking about. But he comes from the music background. So he's one of the few hybrids that was also an inventor as well as a composer and orchestra leader.
I believe, though, that he was the first series of 3 LPs that you showed from him. I think this was music mostly made for advertising. So there was a commercial success.
He did a lot in the late 50s, early 60s. Actually, his wife was a singer, well, both his wives, and would sing a lot of these jingles, a lot of these radio jingles you'd see on TV and land of sky blue waters for beer and all, leave the drive into us. He would compose music for commercials. So that's how he really made a lot of his money, as well as being the band leader for the CBS orchestra after his brother died, who was leading that orchestra as well. But yeah, in fact, there was last year, or before, there's a great record store day comp on Modern Harmonia of his jingles. It's like a 2-record set, and it's fabulous. It's not the electronic per se, but a lot of his stuff, obviously, and the sounds. He worked on a electronic version he invented of the theremin, and we all know the theremin, all those late 50s science fiction movies, that sound, and of course the Beach Boys using it too. So Raymond Scott.
So with
because
all this
the theremin might be, just quickly, Michael, because the theremin might be an instrument that many people are familiar with the name and the sound, but not necessarily the history. It's also a good example of where electronic music can come from, because Leon Theremin, the inventor of the theremin, was a security engineer from Russia who got commissioned a motion detector as a security device for banks in 908, I believe. So basically, if you already saw how a theremin looks like, basically it's 2 antennas, and you put your hand in between and you move and it makes the sound vary. That was a security system.
There's a great documentary on it too, so you should seek it out.
Going back to the beginning, we needed this displayed on camera from you, Mazzy. Get a theremin next time. But coming in the 1940s and early 50s, were these recordings released years and years later, or were they released in that time? Like the box set, the 3 LP you showed first, was it released?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
The EPs I showed you of the German score, that were released when I told you about. The box set, I believe, was released in 1960 or 59. So the French score was more about providing new material for their broadcasting companies. So a lot of this music was very much alive on the air. And you have to remember also that the first records were made in 49, 50 in the US.
Yeah.
It arrived just a little later in France. So I believe that the first Musique Concrète records I have, the earliest ones, would be compilations on forgotten French labels like Candide. And these would be in the mid-50s. They would have been issued a little after the fact.
There's Bob
So
Moog,
it's in
Bob Moog with a theremin.
So those recordings from that era were in mono, I guess.
Yes, but there's also a great story like that of this unintentional electronic music. Philips had this huge factory laboratory between France and Belgium and Holland, and they were basically inventing devices. Sometimes they didn't really understand what they were made for, so they would often just, like when someone was developing a machine, they would make a call for the engineer. Is anyone interested in coming and testing these and seeing what could be done? And there's 2 guys, Tom Disveld and Dick Reichmaker, more known as Kid Baltan, who were 2 electric engineers who became musicians just because they were working for Philips, and were some of the first people to ever test oscillators made for making music. And there's one of these early also electronic music records that is kind of emblematic. It's a 7-inch of the theme from the Kwai River soundtrack, but made only with synthesizers or early synthesizers.
Let's Michael's show their wares.
Texas, Michael.
Hi guys. So I grew up in my household. My father played folk guitar, listened to Santo and Johnny and Richie Valens and Buddy Holly and these Everly Brothers and Clancy Brothers, and that's the world that I, as a child, grew up listening to in my very young age. In 1987, I went to the music shop with my father, and this record was playing over the loud system.
No
This came out in
way.
1986. You know this?
Harold Budd?
No, Ray Lynch.
Oh, I don't know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is a guy called Ray Lynch, who actually was originally from Texas, but lives in San Rafael, north of San Francisco. This was put out by Music West, and this is the first music I heard that had electronic instruments as the basis of everything. So there is some acoustic flute and some viola and guitar, but everything else is Moog synthesizers, Prophets, Oberheims, ARP, Juno 60, like all these classic analog synths. So it's completely like computer based and electronic and analog synth based music. But it's new age, of course. In the background, it's called Deep Breakfast. This is his release, and it says, Evelyn slapped Raymond on the back with a laugh. You must be starved, old friend. Come into my apartments and we'll suffer through a deep breakfast of pure sunlight. Very bizarre. But this was on in the record shop, and my father and I were shopping. This is right when CDs just came out. And my dad bought this on CD, and we played. This is like a very strong record for me I was probably 7 or 8 years old.
Wow.
But
Nice.
very, very bizarre music. Very beautiful. It has, the instrumentation is kind of classical in the way it's structured, but there's a lot of strange electronic noises throughout, and this kind of painting kind of fits the feeling of it for sure. But
What
Stunty,
label
you know
is
this
that
one?
on? Yeah,
It's
I
called
know Ray
Music-
Lynch.
Music West.
Yeah, I believe that Ray Lynch was a dance instructor as well. And I think I have a private press of his that is actually, the music is ghost-written by a guy who at one point was in Tangerine Dream. So that makes kind of sense that he would do that after. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know the history of, but this, I think originally, this is like 1984, 85, but this was pressed in 86, but kind of interesting. If you're into kind of more mellow electronic stuff, especially 80s new agey, I mean, there's parts where it gets laughably cheesy, doesn't hold up today, but it's still nostalgic for me, and a nice interesting record for sure. You can find this. I bought this for like $3 in a charity shop, thrift shop.
Cool. My run. Okay, so Stunty said something very, very interesting to me, because he described how people or musicians like Stockhausen opens at least the European mind to completely different musical influences from the Far East or whatever. And this goes through the decades of electronic music in a way. And this may also be the reason why this guy is considered a very, very influential and important electronic musician. His name is Muslimgauze, and quite a striking story behind him. He is your regular English guy, and somehow he develops this gorgeous music tapes, is very productive, very fertile, put out one audio cassette after the other, and politically he goes into this Palestine problematic and typical cover for Muslimgauze, a typical title, Uzi Mahmoud. He's always into this political stuff, died very, very early due to a mushroom poisoning or something like that. And he is one of the most influential guys in the electronic avant-garde scene up to now. And they are putting out his releases next to a monthly basis. Every 1 or 2 months you have a new Muslimgauze which is found. The main label who is behind him now is Stahlplatt in Berlin, and fantastic musician. And he is also always influenced by the Arabic music, very much sound snippets from that one. Really an interesting artist, and I'm sure Stunty have to add something when it comes to Muslimgauze.
Muslimgauze, yeah, Bryn Jones. He started, his first releases are like from 82, 83, when it's really industrial, which can mean many different things, but he was into tribal noise, rhythmic noise, and he's a guy who was from Manchester. He died in, I believe it was 1998. I discovered him probably around 93, 94. And he was releasing, as you were saying, there was constantly albums coming out from him. Already from Stahlblatt in Germany, but in Europe, at the same time in the US, he on a label called Soleil Moon. So there was so many records of him coming out that me and my friends, who were always after the new ones, we started to joke that there was this disease, the Muslimgauze. We have to have everything from him, because you know how it is.
Last week, a number 87, I think, number 87 came out from Stahlblatt.
Yeah, I mean, when he died in 89, there was already almost 200 records of his out. And he has three styles mostly: rhythmic noise, ambient, and dub, and all of them with Middle East aesthetic. Then, but since he died, there's a cult around him that has grown. There was already a cult around him because the guy, he lived with his parents till he died. Also, his parents had no idea what he was doing. He was doing all the stuff in the garage and producing, like sprouting records after records, just sending the recordings to 2 or 3 labels. Then the labels would package the records. And it is true that his aesthetic was so strong and so unusual that he had a huge impact on modern electronic music from, I would say, from the punk side of things, because he's obviously not a scholar or anything. He was just using the means that were available to him. But he did embrace both the Middle East aesthetic and the electronic aesthetic, because there are some great records of his and also some terrible records of his, totally unnecessary ones.
Yeah. But Mazzy, Michael, how big is the impact of Muslimgauze in the States? Because here in Europe, he's quite a figure.
I don't know about him at all.
I only know him from his name. I've seen his, anytime I go to any record shop for the last 20 years, if you go to the experimental electronic whatever section, you always see a lot of records from him. And I was always curious what the name meant. And I'm also curious, I've heard it a little bit. I've heard maybe only 2 records from friends playing it for me. But in the Middle Eastern, the musical inspiration he had in a lot of his music, was it from a certain country, or was it just kind of a general instrument based?
Oh, it was mostly from the Arabic peninsula. So
yeah,
but say like Iraq.
Yeah, but I think it's quite important to mention that he wasn't a Muslim. It's not religious at all. It was
actually, I think you're wrong.
State.
I think he was wrong? I think you're
Okay.
wrong. He converted to Islam, but he was it was not a big thing for him. Like, it's the labels who made it a bigger thing than it actually was, apparently. That they, of course, the whole Palestinian-Israel conflict angle is very good for shock value for the covers and the titles. So I heard
and then the sudden death.
yeah, of course. Yeah. There's everything. Yeah. It's a made come true for marketing.
It is.
Can you imagine he was doing all this in his parents' garage?
Yeah, within 6 or 7 years, Michael.
So he got into this deep thing that overtook his life completely.
Yeah.
Strange.
All right, Christian, you're next.
I think that then talking about like introductions to electronic music, not necessarily my earliest one, but one album that is quite interesting, that has maybe aged a little bit. Scorn, Evanescence, the third album from Scorn. Scorn is, came out in 1994. Scorn is the project, the band of Mick Harris, the drummer of Napalm Death. So he comes from a thrash grindcore background. But on this third album, if you look at the hype sticker from them, redefining ambient dub. So basically, even if he's a drummer, the main instrument in this is the mixing desk. And I went to see him live back then in a small club in Paris. And that was the first time I saw anything like that, that on stage, there was a bass player, there was a guitar player, but the main attraction was him behind the desk, which is kind of when I discovered more about Musique Concrète, what it is all about. Because if you go to a Musique Concrète gig, usually the artist will be in the middle of the audience in the back, behind the mixing desk, and on the stage, there will only be speakers. An acousmonium, as they call it, which kind of also is an influence on dub and sound system reggae culture. Like, they are very proud of their sound system, their wall of sound. And this, which had someone that Michael Muller probably knows, James Plotkin, who is now a very famous sound engineer who does mastering for lots of black metal and post rock and stuff like that. He was playing guitar on this. He was also in a band called Old on the same label, Earache. But this, when it came out, that was for my 16-year-old self, that was extraordinary. Of course, there's quite strong aesthetics. I mean, this is obviously early Photoshop, like trying to get this varnish of something old and a little bit mysterious and a little bit dark. And this is kind of exactly what the music is. It's very slow, roding tones, drones with very strong bass lines and very dubby drums. And that, I think that this opened electronic music to a lot of people who had lots of prejudice against it. Suddenly this guy who's from metal and who's a legend within this genre is making one of the most revered records in this genre of the 90s.
Where was he from?
From Birmingham, which is one of the best cities for avant-garde in pop music, in my opinion. There's bands like
UK,
Broadcast, Godflesh, Surgeon in techno, Pram, which is probably one of my favorite rock bands. But and also maybe to seek to Michael, there was a remix album of this, which had a remix by Bill Laswell, one by Meatbeat Manifesto, one by Coil, one by Autechre. I mean, this was really
not bad.
Incredible.
Is
I just went on a deep dive with Bill Laswell. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Palominos you should check out too.
Is your copy good? The availability of this album is it?
I don't think so. I think there has never been any reissues of this. There probably will be eventually because it's such a cult record, and Earache, the label, still exists. They probably fucked over Mick Harris at one point or another, so there might be a few difficulties there. But yeah, this is. But you also have to understand that, however we're forward-thinking and revolutionary that was back then, it has aged a little bit. Like the drums, which are kind of breakbeat-ish. We have a lot of more advanced drums in electronic music nowadays. But still, this, because it is quite dark, I would admit. So if you're into that aspect of music, that kind of music, then this has still a huge appeal. And I think the sound quality of this is, the sound production is very unique.
Cool stuff.
Okay, 1967. There's two names that are important that I think a lot of people don't know, and that's Paul Beaver and Bernie Krause. And they made 3 records for Warner Brothers from 1970 to 71, 72, Beaver and Krause. Warner Brothers Records, when I was growing up, was my favorite label because they would stick with artists whether they sold or not early on, whether it's Little Feat, Bonnie Raitt, Van Morrison, Ry Cooder, Randy Newman, etc. But they did some experimental stuff. Now, in 1967, there was an album that's more infamous than it is quality, and it's called The Nonsuch Guide to Electric Music. Nonsuch was a budget label in a way, but a label, a part of Elektra Records. They had a lot of rootsy kind of field recordings of, you know, Panama records, Africa sounds, native to the areas. But they did this box set. I think it's a 2-record box set that Bernie Krause worked on, Beaver and Krause worked on. And really, it's not, I used to have it, I don't have it anymore. But it's a great title, The Nonsuch Guide to Electric Music in 1967. But it's really a lot of like noodling. Here's what this modulator sounds like. And I think there's only one actual composed piece of music on it. But Beaver and Krause were actually the West Coast reps for Robert Moog to sell the Moog synthesizer. And they set up a booth at the Monterey Pop Festival in Monterey, California in 1967. And their whole thing, this was the perfect time, right, of this the Summer of Love was happening. They sold one of the first Moog synthesizers to Mickey Dolenz of the Monkees. And on the Monkees record, I think it's called, what is it, Capricorn, Pisces, that record, there's on 2 or 3 songs, there's some of the first pop uses of the Moog synthesizer. They sold another one to the Byrds, and that was used, the Byrds used it. Obviously, Bernie Krause went to London and sold one to George Martin and one to George Martin and George Harrison. Their records, they're problematic. They're Moog based, but there's jazz music on it. There's Bernie Maupin, there's Jim Keltner. The later one, this is the last of the 3 from 72. There's even some sort of gospel ragtime Scott Joplin pieces on it with some vocals on it. So they're not like great moody recordings. They try to get a little in the pop vein a little bit. But just to kind of piss Michael off in Germany, I have to show this record because this comes out of this record. Bernie Krause went to London to help set up George Harrison's Moog synthesizer after he sold it. Of course, it was used on Abbey Road on several songs, including Here Comes the Sun. Side 2 of this record, and it was controversial only because while at George Harrison's house in Frere Park, Henley-on-Thames, there's a demonstration piece that Bernie Krause kind of composed and just noodling and played with on the Moog synthesizer. George records it and puts it outside too on this record without telling Bernie Krause, and of course it's pissed. This was a label called Zapple Records, which was supposed to be the artsy avant-garde division of Apple Records, and they did John and Yoko records, this record, and it folded fast. It didn't happen. This is an interesting record. It's just noodling, playing around with a Moog synthesizer, and it's 2 pieces, 1 per side. But and in fact, there was some issue right here on some editions. It says Bernie Krause, and then it was whited out his name. So I don't know if there's a lawsuit involved, what happened to it. But Bernie and Krause are kind of a big part of the story, at least on the West Coast scene of synthesized electronic music. They also did a lot of commercials and soundtracks, and Bernie Krause worked on some things at a recording studio in San Francisco called Different Fur that was owned by Pat Gleeson, who was a synthesizer player that helped teach Herbie Hancock with the sextet to play the Moog synthesizer and set him up. So there's all this kind of, 6 degrees of separation on the West Coast scene of pop music and jazz that got into the 80s with Headhunters and all that with Herbie Hancock. So I think Bernie Krause, Beaver and Krause are underrepresented in the story, even though their records aren't as interesting. But look at that cover. It's a beautiful cover.
What did you think of the music back then when it was released?
Well, I actually got these then because I did a video on those Warner Brothers Lost Leader samplers. When I was a kid growing up, the inserts on these records, in fact, here's one right here, you could send away for these 2 record sets, $1 a record. For $2, you get a Warner Brothers sampler, Frank Zappa, Randy Newman, Ry Cooder, Black Sabbath, Bernie and Krause. I first heard it and it was interesting to me. When I've done these videos on how I got into Indian music because of George Harrison and Ravi Shankar, these pop artists led me to that. Is electronic music, a lot of people say it's unlistenable. And I appreciate it more now that 50 years later than I did then. I think the problem with these records is there's no single mood to them. There might be there's one record that has like a funky kind of soulful song, and then just easygoing, mellow, synthesizer-based ambient music. So they're almost trying to do too much to make it accessible. Bernie Krause later would go on to do, there used to be a chain of stores in America called the Nature Company. And Bernie Krause was one of the, sold a ton of CDs to the Nature Company, where he started doing these rainforest electronic music ambient records that were extremely popular. Paul Beaver died at a young age, unfortunately, but Bernie Krause is to me an important part of this story.
Have you ever owned a rain stick?
My photographer, Michel Clement, for 5 years photographed all the products for the Nature Company. So
that was a great store,
right?
They had a kiosk with all the CDs, and you could push a button and listen on headphones. It was incredible.
And then it begat, like, remember Hear Music? It was the chain of Hear Music that had those little things. So I know that's kind of another story, but I think for the West Coast, that's an important part of the story too. And that kind of new agey thing that you were talking about, Michael, about records, how the synthesizer became a part of, whether it's Windham Hill or these new agey kind of things that caught on about that. So anyway, that's my next pick.
So you think that this kind of records got Herbie Hancock into his later stuff?
Well, I know for a fact, I wasn't going to show it, but this is Patrick Gleeson. He did this record of Synthesizers of the Four Seasons. He owned Different Fur recording studios in San Francisco that almost all those first Windham Hill records were recorded in the Mission District. And he owned that studio, and he was at the time married to Joan Jean Renaud, who was the cellist in the Kronos Quartet. That's how I got to know them. And they lived upstairs in this beautiful loft above the studio. He was brought in, he plays on that, I forgot not the Headhunters, before that, the real wild Herbie Hancock synthesized record, I don't have it here, that he plays on. And he's the one that taught and set up Herbie with the synthesizer. Because Herbie, obviously he did acoustic piano with electric piano, but Herbie dived really into the synthesizer. And also Pat Gleeson worked on the soundtrack to Apocalypse Now. All those helicopter sounds weren't real helicopters. It was all synthesizer based. That's a great soundtrack too, even mixed with the Doors on that. But so he's an influence of technically, not really musically to influence Herbie, but it leads, and Paul Beaver worked on these Apocalypse Now, recorded his records at Different Fur. So that's incestuous kind of group of artists and electronic artists, that weren't as much avant-garde. They were recording classical pieces that we all know from my generation, switched on Bach with Walter Carlos, So
interesting.
This is a good lesson today. Learning so much.
It's funny though, because like what you're saying, Mazzy, there's lots of records like that. Like you named Herbie Hancock, but on a much milder level, because it's just keyboards that George Duke is playing on this. But still, this makes the record. That's what makes the record stand apart, the aesthetic, the electronic aesthetic that is very subtle in it, but not just on the level of the aesthetic, also what kind of music can you do when you start using electronic instruments, and records like this that like Michael must know very well, which this one is this is a milestone of electronic music.
What is that?
E2, E4 by Manuel Göttsching.
Oh yeah. Incredible.
This is this has been sampled by house music and pop countless times. So there's this one of the most famous New York house tune called Sueno Latino is basically a ripoff of this, with just some extra hi-hats and drums. But this record also defines everything that a lot of Detroit techno, like Jeff Mills, this very motoric and repetitive, trancy but minimalistic, sparse music.
The 70s, the jazz artists like Weather Report, Joe Zawinul, all those people got into the fusion thing, really got electronic music. Of course, prog, which I'm not going to talk about, but there's a Keith Emerson and all these artists using that as well too. So, all right, Michael.
Was Göttsching, he was a guitarist mainly, right?
Yeah.
There's the American artist Mark McGuire, which is like kind of a total ripoff of some of his guitar-based work. Still beautiful.
Yeah.
Am I up now?
We got through an hour of this without, and I said the Beatles before Michael said Kraftwerk in terms of electronic music. How did that happen?
Because we are stunned about the knowledge.
But
and I don't want to be so profane and mention Kraftwerk when he's talking about this kind of stuff.
Now that Progga has been mentioned, it's something that we very seldom think about. But like at first, there's so many connections. Like this. This is a white label, so that's why I don't have the artwork. But Soft Machine in their this is from '79. There's one whole side of it that is pulsating, Moroder-esque stuff, and then two of the guys from Soft Machine did this album in 1980. No, 78. Yeah, this is pure disco, boogie, electro. It sounds exactly like Justice sounds 30 years later, or 35 years later, like this, these bass lines made on the keyboard, and extreme sharp contrast between the keyboards and the arrangement with the chords and all that. This is the kind of covers you would expect to find in the Dollar Bean also, and there's no mention of this being a Soft Machine, and I think it was only released in France and Italy, but so there are connections like that. And even later, when you think about when electronic music in the most popular way became popular in first, I guess, in the UK with stuff like that, KLF, Chill Out, and then with The Orb. The first album called Adventures Beyond the Ultra World, Patterns and Textures from, basically it's almost like a how would you say, a prog rock album name. And actually they used to work with Steve Hillage from Gong. And when this single was released by The Orb in 91, The Blue Room, 40-minute long song, that topped the charts in the UK, the mainstream charts, at place number 8, a 40-minute long song. So the critics were like, we never expected that prog would have such an influence on pop culture. So they even had to change the rules of what could be a single in the UK, because no one expected that a 40-long song could top the charts. And so it's true that like it's easy now to forget that aesthetically, a lot of this music actually has similar aspiration as prog. And when you think about prog, what it means, progressive, progression, like escaping tonality and liberating yourself from the constraint of the regular instruments, that is as prog as it gets.
Yeah. In a way, yes. True.
Right, Michael.
Okay, in 1995, I'm going to talk about a group I talk about a lot. So sorry if you follow me and you're sick of hearing me talk about the Chicago group called Tortoise. But their first record in 1990, came out in 94. I heard it in 95. Blew open my mind in terms of what could be done when you connect and overlap the melange of electronic and acoustic instrumentation. I didn't see them play until early 1998 when this record came out. It's called TNT. It was on the Chicago label called Thrill Jockey. And when I saw them play, I didn't realize there were so many instruments. It takes up the whole stage. They had Moog synthesizers, some programming, some MIDI, marimba, vibraphone, 2 drum sets, two electric bass and electric guitar. This album starts off almost like a avant jazz experimental, and then by the end of it, it's pure electronic, samples and all sorts of crazy stuff. But this also has woodwinds, has bassoon and trombone and cornet. When I saw this performed live, I was 17 years old, and the opening act for the tour was Oval, O-V-A-L, if you are familiar with him. And from this record, they had a lot of remixes that they commissioned.
Oval.
Is it Oval?
The first.
Yeah, great. So I had incredible music. I'd never really heard music like that. And they had Luke Vibert and Derek Carter, and it's the first time I ever heard of Autechre doing remixes of this stuff. And those are all 12-inch singles, and it is the perfect strange marriage of this kind of jazz-based acoustic instrumentation with this modern Moog, and then also world music mixing in marimba, and it is incredible, strange. Nothing else sounds like this. They just had the 20-year reunion of this album in Chicago at the Museum of Modern Art there. Chicago Museum of Art, what's it called? And they played this whole record in its entirety, and I went just to see it. So this is probably one of the most influential albums of my life.
Looks like a Daniel Johnson
cover
illustration.
Yeah, it really is. I don't know who drew that.
I'm sure it's not him, but
I remember when it came out, I was so pissed off by the cover. Like, what?
I like that.
Yeah, it doesn't really fit the music, but when you listen to this record, it starts off and you get kind of lost, and it seamlessly, totally flows from these kind of ornate jazz, experimental rock compositions into pure straight. There's one song that has a sample that just says over and over, "Oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck," and you don't even really notice that you're listening. It's mesmerizing music. But this is one group that I've been lucky to see a handful of times, and every single time it just totally blows me away with the way they compose and use these instruments. Totally unique sounding music.
Could it be that like the oh fuck sample could be an homage to the Butthole Surfers, cunts on their Locust album?
It really could be. I never really thought about that. I think maybe you're right. It must be, right? Sorry, I'm so sorry, guys.
Okay, Mr. Germany.
Okay, so you mentioned the group, Michael. And for me, this is one of the most important group of the last decade or 2 decades. And this is Autechre. And this Autechre, the sheer magnitude of their releases musically and as a physical object is stunning. They have so great sounding additions, and what I'm showing here is one of 4 parts. All parts are 3-disc vinyl sets, and this is one release, the NTS sessions, and the sheer magnitude to go through those, the impact, the power of this music is sometimes really overwhelming. It's not an easy listening, but
say it again, Michael. It is a 12 LP album. How prog rock is that?
Part 2, 3-disc.
Yeah, I got it as a box set, the whole thing.
Yeah. And part 4. This is one release.
Yeah.
But it's typical for this kind of stuff. And now, if you think, it gets somewhat exchangeable. No, it doesn't. It has such an intensity and magnitude. After 2 hours, you want more and more and more, and they give you more and more and more. It's unbelievable stuff. Completely different of the most listening experience you usually get when you listen to the music we in the BC talk about. This is overwhelming, gorgeous stuff. And this Autechre, I think they are one of the most important bands ever.
I agree.
Yeah.
And for me, quickly, for me, Autechre is the most important band of my youth, and up until 2005, I thought it, between 93 and 2005, it was the most relevant band in any kind of genre. And it's very interesting to talk about them in many regards. This is their first record ever. It's an EP that came out in 1991. It's hardcore, UK hardcore, so it's like proto jungle. So there's lots of sample of like dentist drilling. There's even a sample, like, I've never seen anyone mention this because probably the people who are into that don't know, but there's a sample of Hawkwind in this. It's very short, but then what's interesting is that this is from 2003. It's called Gansgraf, and I think this is their highest point. After that,
point it to the light, maybe. Okay.
No. Yeah, sorry, my lightning. I know we talked about this. My lightning is the best. But what's really interesting about this, there are many things, but there's one thing that we haven't talked about yet regarding electronic music. This music, in a very romantic and literary way, is about the future. It is about being futuristic. When you listen to this, you get this feeling of being projected in a future that is difficult to grasp. This is too much often when you first hear it. It takes a while to accustomate yourself to it. And I remember up until this record of Autechre, almost every time they had a new release, it was like always like 2 steps before me. Like it took a while to find a way to enjoy it sometimes. Sometimes it was direct, but up until this record, it was always, this is the future. And that's one of the most singular qualities of that music. There's not that many kinds of music that literally have the ambition of addressing the concept of future and futurism in a kind of science fiction romantic way.
You know, I always say that Autechre's music is like putting quantum physics into sound. I agree. It's completely futuristic. Michael in Texas, what do you think about Autechre?
I don't know a lot of the big box set you mentioned. I've never listened to that. I only know really the one that has the kind of pink desert sands on the front.
Amber.
Amber, yeah. That's the only one I really spent a lot of time with. But I remember when I first, in the late 90s, I listened to Autechre and Aphex Twin a lot and like trying to get into that world a little more. And there's a lot, I mean, I'm always wanting to hear melody, and there's always not melody. So sometimes it's not the best, but there are very nice moments of serenity and clarity kind of mixed in. But it's really nice, especially in nice headphones, to listen to that stuff. It's just, the mixing is superb.
There's one thing that you have to understand also about Autechre, that it mostly is a music that is about rhythm, about percussions and structures. Basically, if we go back to the technical aspect of music, of electronic music, most of the music in the past 20 years now has been made through Max MSP, which basically is a program that lets you build your own virtual instruments. So you're only limited by your imagination in a certain way. And that's what they are all about. At the core of it also, most of their rhythms, you could draw a parallel with hip hop, because most of it is 90 BPM, beats per minute. And they just deconstruct the whole hip hop trope, traditional trope, and make it something that is at times antagonistic and at times seducing, and at times both at the same time.
Michael, the box set you showed, it's for the NTS sessions, right? And this is a UK radio program.
Those are the NTS sessions, right? Right.
And if anyone's unfamiliar, the NTS radio program, they also have a really nice series still going on today of having artists come in and do mixtapes, playlist, and DJ, which you can stream, and you can learn about a lot of great music that way. I listen to those quite a lot. We'll link it.
And I have sometimes the opinion, probably not a bit stupid what I say now, but it's my own personal feeling. I think this kind of music nowadays is more connected to people like the late John Coltrane than anything. If you are looking for the new John Coltrane or a new Sonny Rollins, you may find him in this area of music nowadays.
Wow.
It's quite a good point. So often I believe that Autechre are at their best when they are remixing someone else, because whenever they do a remix, or 99% of the time, it turns out to become an Autechre track in the end. And I remember there's one remix they did of this band called Klute, which is a drum and bass band, and basically it sounds like a drum solo of free jazz. But the most exciting you've ever heard. And when you vary the speed, which actually they are very playful with that, how they release sometimes records that are not at the right speed or at the speed that it was composed. You have to figure it out by yourself. It's minor in their career, but it has happened. But yeah, there is the level of complexity and inventivity in the rhythm is you would get the same feeling as when you hear Tony Williams for the first time, and stuff like that.
Wow. If there was one Autechre record you could recommend to someone coming into it new, which would you guys recommend?
The one you told about, the Ember.
2003 release?
You know what? It's funny because Ember is probably one of the most talked about, because it's the most, it's the one that has got kind of ambient pieces that it's the more easy to access. But it was conceived as a follow-up to their first album, pressured by the label, who asked them, please, we want you to do the same thing again. So this is an album that they kind of hate themselves in a way, because they were forced
again with John Coltrane stunted. This is their ballads.
Yeah. No, but it's true, yeah.
Point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's their least Autechre one in some way, even if the whole harmonic system they have.
But still, Stunty, it opens the door. In a way, it opens the door. And then maybe Exile, the 3-disc album, and also gorgeous one and easier to get in than other stuff.
Maybe there's one thing we need to point out then, is that in this kind of electronic music, EPs, albums, is kind of a very fluid concept. Like most of their EPs, which are 4 songs, are double 12 inches in the 90s. And they are as worth, if not more, than the albums. I think that the more compact a release you get from Autechre, this is where you'll get the biggest essence of them in a way. And we really are curious to hear Mazzy's take on Autechre when he will.
I have no
I hope
idea
you
what the
get
fuck you guys are talking about half the time here. I obviously you've watched some of my videos. I bring it back. My main thing is harmony, melody. I'm a big melody fan. So any of this music, a lot of times I bring it back to the pop realm. I don't mean like current pop in 2020s or even the 90s or the 2000s. During the 80s and early 90s, I would go to see a lot of these sort of performance pieces, avant-garde pieces. In the early 80s, I went to see Throbbing Gristle. And to me, that kind of stuff it interests me. It was so out there. And even though I bought those records, I hardly ever listened to them, but I love seeing them live. Yeah, I'm not showing any Throbbing Gristle. That's it's a comp, right? Yeah. But
It's called
I'm
The
going to go with,
Beginner's Guide to the Music of Throbbing Gristle.
very commercial, because I'm going to an album that's 21 years old now. That was, a Brit pop band that made 2 or 3 records, and then they did this Kid A, and everything in its right place. When I put this CD on, when I first got it, I was blown away. To me, it was one of the most beautiful things I had heard at that time. I had a CD of that in my office. I literally had the song repeat about 10 times. You can repeat that one track. This is for a lot of, obviously Radiohead fans who had been with them since Creep and even OK Computer. This, I think, alienated a lot of their audience. And I know Thom Yorke really didn't want to do another Britpop or another rock and roll record, guitar based, that all these bands were doing. And I think this was a challenge for them. It was originally recorded enough. It's going to be a double album. And of course, it was split. And then after this, Amnesiac was the second part of it. I think the first part is more successful, although you could interchange it. I love the national anthem, the song on here. But to me, this is a perfect record. But I know how it turned people off. And it led them on a path that a segment of their audience and people get tired of. Moonshaped. I go with, what I like about them too is their visualization with the artists they work with and their packaging is as important as the music. And the box sets with all these great artists. This is In Rainbows, I'm sorry. Beautiful cover, beautiful artwork. I'm not going to get into all that, but Moonshaped World, gorgeous artists where they worked on these great large canvases with these painters and visual artists. And of course, they got into a whole other thing. The way, I think when they put out I think it was Kid A was the record, or the one after that, they decided anybody who wants it could have it for free originally, streaming or pay. And it turned out people paid for it. Kid A was a #1 record for weeks in the UK. It was #3 in the United States. So they found their commercialism in a way with these great, beautiful physical art and ambient art. And of course, Tom's vocals aren't for everyone, but it's very, very accessible. And his solo records and his collaboration with Atoms for Peace, with Flea, the bass player from Red Hot Chili Peppers, I think is a great, great record. That's one of those records. I think Michael and I had this experience once. I can't remember now if that's a 45 or 33, but for the first month I played it at the wrong speed.
Anime.
And I didn't even, that's right. And I didn't even notice the difference, and it didn't matter.
Exactly.
It's so beautiful to me. So I tend to get into this music as much as I like ambient. I don't play a lot of that unless I'm working, and I might put it on a CD or something, but I like the song-based, a little structure to my ambient music on a regular basis. And I think that's a good way for people who can't get exposed to the avant-garde through pop artists like that. And I was going to show, but I'm not going to show Bjork. Bjork's another one like that, who really just, as an artist, as an auteur, her visual styles. And again, I won't show them except for, showing all these records to me that are beautiful. pop, rhythmic dance, electronic records that mix them. And she comes from the post-punk, because I saw the Sugar Cubes when they first came around. And that's how I first got introduced to her. But I love that she's really gone into the visualization and the art side of it. And museum. Go ahead.
I think that
I think we did maybe Michael is thinking the same thing as I am. I think we did a slight mischaracterization of Autechre, in the sense that it is way less unmelodic as you seem to have gotten from us. It's just that they got a very unique and personal harmonic system that you can find in most of their releases, and the way the melody is kind of hidden makes it, when it finally comes out, one of the highlights of the music.
It's not like it's not like electronic drone then? It's not?
No.
Okay.
No, it is the way they will like sculpt a melody.
Got it.
Is very unique, but it's quite skeletal. But like when you finally, usually a typical Autechre song will start with drums, and then there will be some drones and harmonies, pads, and then a skeletal kind of melody that either you like or you don't. There are some I think are beautiful and some that annoy me. So it's a bit just like any kind of band. But you have to also think that this is one of the two bands that really made the label Warp, with Aphex Twin that Michael was talking about. But the one that actually really started it all for Warp, they just had a smaller career, is the band that Thom Yorke actually names as the main influence for Kid A, which is this LFO, this is the original. This is the reissue from a few years ago as a double LP with all the tracks. There's 2 tracks missing on the original. As you guys who are more into, for the people who are more into the concept of albums and all that, this is almost as close as it gets, as far as I'm concerned, as a perfect album. There is like 14 songs on this. There's not a single one that isn't good. Okay. Every single one feels from being from the same artist, but also is different from each other. Almost everything has hooks, very catchy ones, and it is also the kind of house techno albums that no one does anymore, because nowadays it will have like 2 or 3 kinds of styles of constructions, and that's it. You'll have like a techno track, like a more like down tempo track, and maybe one ambient track. This is the real. This is an album for the ages.
I'm amazed on how all in the last few years, maybe it's been longer, and I've just been more aware of it, that these bands that to me started out in the indie realm as folk, Americana, really merge into the electronic or psychedelic also. Even groups in the UK like Temples, they started doing more dance-based. Bon Iver, from obviously his Wisconsin kind of folky, lo-fi, folk, freak folk, whatever you want to call it. Now it's synthesizers and all these different remixers on them. These artists have really gotten into that kind of stuff, and the fans, it's gonna, the cliche, which I sound like an old fart, you're talking about the Coachella crowd. Every band is synthesized, dance-based pop in a way, and not to put it down at all, but they've merged into that, where I get into the folk scene or the other scene, but it's so much electronic music fusing into all this other stuff now. I mean,
Autechre were twice headlining the Coachella festival in the 90s.
Is Val Murray's dance record coming out soon? I don't even know, you know?
Well, I think it goes back to what Stunty was saying. It's like when you take away an acoustic instrument, you remove the limit to the sound, to the sonic, to the frequencies, and to the, to the depth of hearing. Like, so you have this whole new palette and all these new colors. So I think that an artist like Bon Iver, yes, he could continue to make the same folk album over and over again, but it's so much more interesting as an artist to expand the color palette.
I don't even mean it as a criticism, but I totally get that. Because, the joke with me is what I like about the Beatles, that every record they did something different. They didn't try to repeat themselves each time. And I love that when an artist does that. I don't need, Fleetwood Mac to do Rumors every year, or something. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I think that you put
Mazzy,
out Kid A was a great thing that you did that, because that also shows very positive mechanisms. You know, with Kid A, they took out a lot of this electronic avant-garde. They took out the merits, the good things, and brought it to a wider audience. And this also means that some people get into this kind of avant-garde stuff more due to the release of Kid A. So this is a very positive thing, I think, when artists like Portishead or Bjork are so successful and become huge and took this kind of stuff out of the avant-garde scene.
And again, LFO was actually the secret weapon of Bjork, as he produced the first 4 or 5 albums of hers with Graham Massey. But
Really?
and he also produced some Depeche Mode.
There you go. Yeah.
Incredible.
Okay.
Does it stand for low frequency oscillator?
Exactly.
The acronym LFO?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, I didn't realize that about the Bjork production. Amazing.
Yeah, like
Mazzy.
No, go on. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No. I'm just curious if I will say that Kid A is my favorite Radiohead, and I really love the Eraser, the Thom Yorke solo record. But I was curious if you've heard the newest Thom Yorke collaboration with Fortet and Burial, Mazzy.
A brand new one?
Nice. Maybe it came out 4 months ago.
I have the solo album he did where he made that 10-minute video. I forgot who he worked with.
This is like during the pandemic this came out.
No, I haven't heard it.
I think it's just 2 songs. I'll send it to you. It's quite nice.
Okay. Your turn, I guess.
Who? Me?
I think it's your turn.
Whose turn?
I've lost count.
I did Radiohead, so.
Come on, Michael, go.
Okay. So I recently did a video on my channel, a new series where I'm kind of highlighting one specific artist and talking about their history and their music. The first one I did was on the musician Grouper, and I love her music, and I kind of love her taste, and anything she mentions I will check out because I just appreciate her ear and her aesthetic. And in one early interview I was reading of Grouper, they asked what her favorite record of all time was, and she said this.
Oh,
which is interesting because this
Wolfgang
is a German guy named Wolfgang Voigt, and this is called Gas, G-A-S. There it is. And this is his album called Pop. This is on the German label called Compact, and this is pure like hypnotic, like repetitive hypnotic, these little, like a small little loop and a sample over and over and over again, but it's very organic and very human sounding. I have no clue how this music is made or what he's using to make this music. All the records are very similar aesthetically, with like a zoomed in shot of a tree or a forest with just the name Gas in the front. And I think they all
one
have
color.
single.
There's also the theme is that every cover has one major color. Yeah.
I checked this out, not knowing what it was. Good. Yeah, it's not for everyone. It takes a little bit of time. You have to sit with it, and it's one that you really.
Michael, Mazzy will love him.
Yeah.
You too. I've already.
Really.
I have to take your box on the way because of you too. Jesus Christ.
You will love it because also there's a literary connection. The previous album from Gas is called Zauberberg. There's this Thomas Mann connection. And the way the music is being done actually is in a way similar to The Caretaker that you love so much. He basically uses romantic classical music loops that he slows down so much and use the revolution of the loop as the pulse, because there is a pulse in that music. It is post club music in a way. There will be a rhythm structure that is repetitive, but very much in the not in the forefront.
Where's he from? Where's he from?
From Germany.
Germany.
Oh, I would think in Germany they would. I thought in Germany they'd call it petrol.
Petrol. That's good. funny for the Autobahn. Yeah.
Come on, we got to have a little humor.
But anyway,
This music is too
put
fucking
this
serious.
sample
Oh.
this digitally and put it on late at night and kind of read a book or kind of get lost. I mean, it is lay on the
Put it on
ground.
while I'm watching
And I will
the
say
Corner
this.
video.
Yeah.
They
but
just,
the
by the
biggest
way,
right-
I would
It's much
suggest
better than Mecca 3.
they just reissued a record of his that originally came out as an EP called October, which is in my opinion his absolute best, and now it's an extended version of it, so it's an LP.
Great.
As we're digging into Kraftwerk jokes, so because Mazzy had his Beatles, so here is something, I don't know if Michael knows this, but there's something else that we didn't mention, is how electronic music is important for the Afro-American community also, because of house, techno, electro. This is the Elecktroids, which is basically Drexciya, Afrofuturistic Detroit techno electro band. And this album that came out on Warp in '95 is obviously a pastiche of Kraftwerk, and it's a perfect album. Also, there's something like there's 11 songs. Every one of these is great, and it is Detroit techno and Kraftwerk at the same time. And this was for years like a holy grail for many people, but I think it got reissued a couple of years ago, so now it's readily available with some bonus tracks as well. But this is a really kind of at the crossroads of many things that we've been talking about.
Amazing. It's interesting that the color of that album cover is similar to the Kraftwerk. What's the album called? Computer Love? I don't know the title. Similar color.
Michael?
Yes, sorry, I was just
so
excuse me.
Michael, the other Michael was saying that this is also visually, of course, a reference to Kraftwerk, to a certain album of them.
Sure, it is. Even you know, there are 4 guys also to a Beatles album.
It's like the Beatles. God.
You guys.
Elecktroids, the other Fab Four. Yeah.
All right, Michael, Germany. Let's see. What do you got?
Okay, I get into a different realm we haven't talked about so much. Ambient, but a special branch inside the ambient area. Dark ambient. My favorite, at least up to now, my favorite branch of the ambient scene, and this is Dedekind Cut.
Oh, amazing.
And you know that, Michael?
Tahoe, yeah, of course.
Yeah. For me,
and
Stunty said that term several times now. This is a perfect album.
Beautiful cover.
Gorgeous listening, Dedekind Cut. Yeah, he only has 2 albums out. I think 2 or 3, not much. It's from when is this album? I don't find it here. I'm sorry, but fantastic album on the Cranky label. A little hard to get now.
Cranky.
Let's hope that there will be a reissue very soon. But this dark ambient stuff.
Explain that. Explain what dark ambient is.
Watch an avant-garde horror movie.
Like goth metal? No.
No, not at all. Very drony, mellow,
kind of like
slow,
minor keyed. It's like pretty somber.
I would argue that there is no such thing as non-dark ambient. Ambient, if it is ambient, it is dark, because real ambient has tension. Whereas when you
but I don't consider Brian Eno dark.
Yeah, I was going to say Brian Eno stuff's very light, music for airplanes, all that kind of,
Yeah.
And one thing,
which makes it kind of almost new age. But
well, that you could argue that, but it's bad branding for a lot of people who get turned off by that genre.
For example, The Caretaker is also sometimes considered as dark ambient. Yes, aspects of dark ambient, but this is pure, in my opinion, pure dark ambient. Very hypnotic. You always, you know, there's always a demon who will come around the next corner when you listen to the music. You always feel there is something dark out there, and it will come, but you never know when it comes.
But it's not, Michael, I would say that it's not dark in like an adolescent, like Marilyn Manson way, because there is darkness, but there's also the balance to it. There is also serenity, because you can compare it like as a band that Michael must love, Stars of the Lid, all their early stuff. It's more on the new modern classical side of things, but earlier you'd have like these drones and these pads that are very serene, and suddenly something shifts and it gets somber and way more tension. But that's this contrast that makes this music really interesting.
Great.
And
exactly.
The Dedekind Cut is great, like Mazzy. It's not dark, like there's nothing like abrasive. It's very easy to hear and listen to, but it's not like uplifting, happy music.
That's okay. No,
but one thing great, Dedekind Cut is the guy's name, and it's very important actually because there are not a lot of black people making this type of music, and he is one.
Right.
So well worth a check out.
Should we do one more full round, maybe, or
as you like?
We can go on, but let's do at least one more.
I can go on. You guys decide.
I think Stunty is.
Go ahead.
Is now.
There's one other thing, like we kind of touched this a little bit, but on one of Michael's recent videos about like electronic records, it really highlighted one of the misunderstandings about electronic music also, which is we talked about how electronic music can be tape music, which means that like collage, sound collage, etc., and ambient can field recordings, or oscillators, so pure tone. And when people think that electronic music is better suited for the CD, that probably means that in their head, in their mind, they associate electronic music with digital sound, which we obviously proved is not the case necessarily and historically. That being said, there are artists that totally embrace the digital aesthetic of sound. One such is SND. SND is a British band from Manchester. I know that there's not much to see on this cover, but they are contemporaries of Autechre, and as much as Autechre also embraces the digital aesthetic at times, it is not the core of what I do. SND is the core of what I do. A little bit like early Oval that Michael was mentioning. The first Oval record is basically made out of samplings of CD skippings. So it's using the harmonies that you get when a CD skips, and they arrange it into a linear musical construction that kind of almost sounds like Hawaiian ambient in a way. And this comes from embracing the digital aesthetic, but the accident, the glitch. SND is really much more on the hard science level in a way, really trying to seek out frequencies that cannot exist outside of the digital realm. And sometimes it's great, sometimes it's a little bit too much, but when it's great, it is such a challenge to the ears, something, but it's not challenge as something difficult, it's just finally I hear something I've never heard before. And it can be very beautiful.
What is the letters you're saying? SND?
SND.
Okay. I need to check. I've never seen that before.
They've been around since the mid-90s. And the main guy in this, Mark Fell, he's become like kind of a go-to guy for sound art and all that. And his son is making post-club music that is amazing. That 45 RPM Michael and I talked, and who is, in my opinion, one of his son, Ryan Trinor, one of the few guys who's doing something that still is futuristic, still is like, where is this coming from? Where the reference points are very difficult to grasp at first, but also very rewarding, because he managed to do what his dad does with electronica, but push it into the dance music territory, so in a much more hedonistic way.
Check it out for sure. Amazing.
Yes.
My final showings are dedicated to Michael here.
Yes.
Now, 1980, Paul McCartney, January, goes on tour with Wings, and right when they enter Japan, he gets busted. He's in jail for 10 days. Wings splits up. He had worked on some of this record before, but then during, in a way, his pandemic after, you could argue, he was fooling around at home with a studio, turned into McCartney 2. The reason they called it that is because it's 10 years after his first solo album, and it's only him doing everything. This is the McCartney album that people either love or they hate it completely. It's synthesizer based. It's got a song, Temporary Secretary, which actually years later became this sort of cult, semi-club thing. But the thing about this, and Christian and I spoke about it briefly, is the B-side of this 12-inch, which is called Secret Friend, only available on a B-side, a 10-minute electronic ongoing, I wouldn't say it's drone or ambient, but it's a repetitive piece of music, and it's a beautiful piece of music. So, you know, Paul always wanted to have a little avant-garde side to himself, and he kind of teases it, never fully goes totally in on it. I know there's 2 CDs that Christian hates that Paul McCartney did with Youth under the name Fireman, which are very ambient, electronic-based, moody records. This one's called the Fireman. It's called Rushes In. And the name, because Fireman Rushes In is a line from Penny Lane. And of course, if nothing else for our fans out there, the artwork on the CD, inner artwork, was pretty controversial for McCartney fans there.
Nice.
These were records that he did alone. Oh, actually, he did jointly with Youth, who was the bass player of the post-punk band Killing Joke. And they did a series of them. The third one they did, Electronic Arguments, is actually a song based. So that's the one that's not a electronic based record. So that's my closeout.
Youth, who also was a collaborator of the Orb.
There we go. And yeah, so this is actually very influenced, bringing it back to Michael, very influenced from Kraftwerk. You know, he listened to a lot of Kraftwerk there. So there is a connection between Kraftwerk and Paul McCartney, 1980.
This is very, I mean, if you like Radioactivity, this is very much in tune with that, in my opinion. It is a
right. So
fantastic B-side.
That's my final electronic offering. Michael?
Good Beatles working. So on my picks, I started from my youth, and I'm ending now with the most contemporary artist I have that I consider electronic based. This is the experimental artist Jefre Cantu-Ledesma. If you're not familiar with Jefre, he has achieved a great amount of success, in my opinion, in this niche world of ambient experimental stuff. He used to run a label called Root Strata, which has put out a bunch of amazing records, and a blog that's how I used to find out about obscure music. This is all looped electric guitar, and I believe it's a Lynn drum machine, like an 80s analog drum machine that was recorded to tape. Jefre had his own label, Shining Skull, and now releases on Mexican Summer. Very accessible, experimental, electronic, ambient style music, and he's collaborated with all sorts of people. He's actually now a Zen Buddhist priest as well as a musician from the Bay Area. He was in a band called Tarantel in the early days. and now is making music under his own name and has recently moved to upstate New York. Extremely prolific, beautiful human, beautiful artist. All of his stuff is great. There's something for everyone. This was a repress of an album that came out, I believe, in 2013. But this is a great 2 long form pieces that are like looping guitar with programmed electronic drums. And most of his newer stuff is more a bigger mix of acoustic and electronic instrumentation. This one's a little more simple. Very nice.
You mentioned
check out Jefre.
You mentioned the Lindrum. That's a great connection also to more mainstream music, because the Lindrum is the electronic drum machine that is one of the best, that has the most distinctive aesthetic to it. And well, this guy is the master of the Lindrum as well. Okay. All of Prince's early stuff he uses the Lindrum.
I hear he's pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah, Tarantelle is a really good band. Like the early Tarantelle stuff, the band he used to be in before was a post-rock band that was, I believe, a little bit boring at first, but they came into something very different. And the last 4 releases were fantastic. And he really set himself on a path that was that you couldn't have expected from the earliest releases of his career. And now I fully support Michael's recommendation on his. This is really great stuff with a great crossover appeal.
Yep, totally. Your dog is ready to go outside, I think.
No, he's just looking because his arch enemy is in the other garden, and he's looking there, looking to him if he's out there. If they see him, we will hear that. Believe me.
Okay, Mike.
Okay, last turn. You know, every once in a while there is a new artist, and this new artist gives you the feeling, okay, now we have the next level, the next step. We talked about Autechre. Some of us think that was a new level, and I agree. And new artists where I think this is the next level is this one. And this is Gabor Lazar. It's in a way in the tradition of Autechre, but he goes out there. It's completely new structured music to me, and you know, I'm not so big in describing music in not mother tongue language, but try him out. He is striking, really striking. Not so hard to get into. Really great stuff. Gabor Lazar. What I have here.
I fully agree with Michael. No, I fully agree with you. Like I played one of my latest video. I played the last track of the A side on this. What was great with Gabor Lazar, and who's buddy with Ryan Trinor and Jesse Born Lentier. There are the 3 of them and a few others. You were saying that Autechre used to be the future, and I agree that that's why I say that up to 2005, because what happened in 2005, suddenly the punks, Autechre, Aphex Twin and all that, who started from electro and went to experimental, there was like a historical loop that resolved. Suddenly they made the whole journey back and forth within avant-garde music. And there was nothing really new to tell. What happened is that suddenly where was there anything left to discover within dance music, the electronic dance music? And that's what these guys are doing. Gabor Lazar, he takes this avant-garde electronics, very digital but aesthetic, by the way, also very hard sounds, and he inserts them in some of the most popular electronic dance music, hedonistic, like Chicago house, footwork, juke, and he makes it like it's the first time you hear it in a club. It feels challenging, but then you hear there's a real groove to it that really talks to the body before it talks to the mind or the heart. It is body music with great harmonies.
What's great, Santi? You are able to explain me why I like this music, and that's great.
That's a very interesting point to say it's body music. I love that. I might just feel that.
It is like now we only have I'll cheat and I'll do quickly. I have the few things I wanted to talk quickly, and one thing that we talked before on with Michael in the background, how all this music that often is being called electronic music, the club music, house, techno, etc. If you're really brutally honest about it, this is not electronic music in the pure sense. If you, for example, if you look at one of the most classic keyboards of electronic music, as we popularly know it, the SH-101 from Roland, an early 80s keyboard, which has been used in just about every pop song in the 80s and 90s that were using keyboards. If you look at the manual of it, there's 4 pages of how does it work, and then there's 76 pages of setups to make the keyboard sounds like an instrument, like a flute, a trumpet, a viola. So basically, they make this machine philosophically totally against what is electronic music, escaping familiarity, escaping tonality. Suddenly, as also Mazzy was saying earlier, how when the synthesizer got smaller, which meant also less synthesis in it, less oscillators, and more, how would you put it, functional, more functional, like one of the greatest pieces of electronic instruments for house music, the TB-303, which is a bass synthesizer. The whole acid from acid house, comes from this. This is a bass synthesizer for people who didn't have a bass player. So it's basically originally a cheap cop-out that just because of sheer inventivity and necessity got retooled into something more interesting, which also back to minorities and black culture, when disco got totally obliterated by the neocons in the late 70s. They didn't want to have anything, the disco, like this welcoming music, where like black people, Latino, old people, gay people, everyone was welcome in the club for disco. Of course, the neocons, that was not the greatest thing. You have to divide people. And so they paid the radios so that disco wouldn't exist. There was this movement, Disco Sucks, where they literally made people burn and destroy their disco records. So suddenly, kids in the early 80s who wanted to do disco, there was no economy for it. You couldn't like put together a band because you would never get played, you would never get a record deal. So they bought these cheap synthesizers to make a disco band. And in the process, they didn't do disco, they did something else. They invented house music, they invented techno. So this music is the music of necessity and also of economic violence in a way. And that's why this music also is very physical, to get back to the point, body music.
And these inventions of synthesizers and processors and programmers and computers put a lot of musicians out of work, unfortunately, too. And they had to kind of reinvent themselves. You didn't need, a whole string section, for instance, on your records.
Maybe, but I don't think it lasted that long.
On the other hand, it got a lot of people into music because it was easier.
Oh, absolutely. Studios, we know about recording studios too.
So I wanted just to show a few records. First, one for Michael, 45 era. Yeah, the audiophile Michael. This record
He's audiophile too, by the way.
Yeah, I know. Kjell Samkopf, Norwegian composer. This is percussion music, modern classical, with electronic treatment. This is from 83, I believe. And I wanted to show this because, in my opinion, this is the best sounding record in my whole collection.
Wow.
This is an audiophile record, in my opinion, that no one knows about, because audiophile people usually aren't really into like music that is not like, this is a nobody. This guy hasn't done anything that no one would have really noticed, apart from a little bit in Europe in the 80s in modern classical. And for some reason, the pressing of this, which means the cutting, the mixing, is spellbinding, even for someone who has a very basic sound system. I'll say that now with also the new knowledge. Most of you guys know I press records for a living. I own a record plant. And so the concern of what actually is a good pressing and how you achieve that, and what is the myth and what is reality of what you can do, I have quite extensive knowledge. And I think that we might be talking about that some other time. But this record, Kjell Samkopf, music for solo percussion and electronics, is one of the best sounding records I've heard in my whole life, and I've heard millions of records. A little hyperbole,
wow.
but and something for Mazzy. This is William Basinski's music for shortwaves on Raster Noten from '98. William Basinski is someone that I think both Michaels love. And
obsessed.
Yeah, and this is as Mazzy has, yeah, as Mazzy has been into the Caretaker. There's the Caretaker, obviously, yeah, he is his music would, I don't know if it would exist the same way without William Basinski, but this one is a record of his that is less talked about usually. I think when I told Michael about it, he didn't even know it existed. It's maybe his earliest LP, and it is more electronic than tape based, so which is a little bit different than what you usually know about from him. This is more proper electronics. And
you know this album, Michael? Have you heard of this album?
I don't know that one, no. And I thought I knew
very much
everything
into
of him.
It is from 1998.
Yes,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have most of his early stuff on CD, but I've never seen that one.
Yeah, it's in the same series. You know, when Alvanotto did this collaborations with Ryoichi Sakamoto, he did 3 LPs. This is the same series, but this believe this is the first one. This is the seventh release on Noton, Alvanotto's label. So it's quite early in his career. And then there's, as I'm French, I had to mention a little bit of French music. And as we all are into jazz, probably one of the greatest and most famous jazz players from France, Michel Portal, who's a clarinet saxophone player and who's famous for being one of the greatest improvisers. Like all his records are live. He doesn't do studio recordings. Apart from the one time he did one studio recording solo, where he plays everything and overdubs it. And there's this track on this called African Ritual, where he plays the bass clarinet and shouts in it so hard that it starts sounding like a didgeridoo. And he just loops everything in the most creative way possible at the time. This is from '79. And this is a record that is still very underrated because it's very different from what he's famous for. But this is probably more appealing for most people than his regular stuff. And also more price-wise appealing because you can still find it for quite cheap. And on the my real electronic music hero Bernard Parmegiani, whom I got every single record he did, and these beautiful Philips silver cover records. I want you guys to indulge me. I know this has been reissued recently. There is this record of his on the INA GRM label, which is the French National Archive, which is basically a loop back to the beginning, as this is the club that was started by Pierre Schaeffer, the Musique Concrète guy. This is Musique Concrète. And there's this track on this. This album is called Dehors, Dehors, Inside, Outside. And there's a track called Pour en finir avec le pouvoir d'Orphée, to end it all with Orpheus' power. This is the most powerful music I've heard in my whole life. This is pure electronic music.
Damn.
But it's a linear story being told with all the means available from electronic music, tape music, digital synthesis, old school oscillators with lamps, harmonizers. And this is some of the most intense music I've ever heard. As sometimes it's just like bursts of power, energy, of sound, and sometimes it becomes very melodic, very almost symphonic in a way. And this is absolutely stunning music that, like, if you want to touch at what some of the ultimate potential of what electronic music allows, this is it. Bernard Parmegiani, Dehors, Dehors. But this is the original, the reissue on Mego is available, I believe, and with another cover. And lastly, I wouldn't be stunty if I didn't show you a record with some
cartoon text.
Of course.
Cover your children's eyes.
Yeah, so this is experimental audio research here. The band from Sonic Boom from the Spaceman 3 that he did with Kevin Shields from My Bloody Valentine, Kevin Martin from The Bug God, and Eddie Prévost from AMM. And this is when I discovered this in 1996. I wasn't ready for this because this is pure drone electronic music made from vintage synthesizers. And
doesn't look drony, that cover, not at all.
No, but this is by the way, this is Anthony Ausgang who did the cover, the guy who does all these covers for MGMT and all these bands. And this is stunning, stark, dark brooding drones and pure electronic sounds in a very ambient, atmospheric, and almost utilitarian, in a way that is in the Brian Eno way, you could say. But there's something a little weird about it. And what's interesting with this is that this guy, Sonic Boom, in this he references La Monte-Young, Delia Derbyshire, and many other pioneers a good 10, 15 years before mainstream underground culture like The Wire magazine and all this starts to address these guys, which kind of tells you how before his time, even with the Spaceman 3, this guy was. And yeah.
Wow.
So that's it for part 1. 9 parts.
Thank you, Dr. Stunty, for the deep lesson. It's great.
Yeah, that's what I call passion, Stunty.
Yeah, and it's passion when I feel like almost frustrated by all the stuff that we didn't talk about, but it's great. You have to start somewhere.
We want to introduce people to it. I mean, I learned a lot today. I think we all learned something because,
And I hope really that our audience realize that there was very little indulgence in this. Like most of the stuff that we talked is actually really worth seeking out and testing for yourself. We talked about mostly music that I think has something to offer to just about anyone, even even if you feel you have prejudice against electronic music. I just hope really that people understand that that some of the main lessons we should have from this discussion, I learned stuff like just by interacting with you, rhetorically, that like electronic music is just music, and it has as much, if not more, diversity than you would expect from traditional pop music, because pop music is part of electronic music as well.
Yeah, of course. Kid A.
And rock, even rock music has.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Hang
Thank
on
you
there.
for the-
Thank you very much.